Hello and welcome back to the Sleepy Historian. Settle in, find a comfortable spot, and let the noise of the day fade into a gentle hum. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time, not to a grand battle or a royal court, but to something far more personal, far more intimate. We're going to explore the simple act of washing, of bathing, and uncover a time when this ritual, which we now see as a cornerstone of health and comfort, was viewed with suspicion and even outright fear. Did you know that for centuries, the most educated and powerful people in Europe believed that a hot bath could literally kill you? It's a strange thought to ponder as you stand under a hot shower, but the story of how we went from the grand public baths of Rome to a deep-seated fear of water is a fascinating journey through medicine, disease, and the very way we perceive the world around us. So take a deep breath and let's begin. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, perhaps consider subscribing. It helps our little corner of history continue to grow. Our story begins, as so many do, in the ancient world, specifically in the heart of the Roman Empire. For the Romans, bathing wasn't just about getting clean, it was a fundamental pillar of society. Imagine stepping into a Roman thermae, a colossal public bathhouse. This wasn't a simple room with a tub. It was a sprawling complex of architectural wonder, with soaring ceilings, intricate mosaics underfoot, and marble statues gazing down from their pedestals. The air would be thick with steam, echoing with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and the splash of water. You would move through a series of rooms, a warm room to acclimate your body, then a hot, steamy room to sweat out impurities, much like a modern sauna, and finally a room with a cold plunge pool to close the pores and invigorate the senses. But it was so much more than that. The thermae were the social hubs of the city. Here you could conduct business, debate philosophy, exercise in the gymnasium, read in the library, or simply relax and gossip with friends. It was a daily ritual, accessible to rich and poor alike. Cleanliness was synonymous with civilization, a mark of what it meant to be Roman. But empires, no matter how mighty, are not eternal. As the Western Roman Empire began to crumble in the 4th and 5th centuries, so too did the magnificent infrastructure that supported its way of life. The grand aqueducts, those marvels of engineering that carried fresh water for miles across the landscape, fell into disrepair. Without a constant supply of water, the great thermae could no longer function. Their fires went out, their pools ran dry, and their marble halls fell silent. The sophisticated culture of public bathing began to fade from memory in Western Europe. The skills to maintain such complex plumbing systems were lost, and the resources to build new ones were scarce. The fall of Rome wasn't just a political event, it was a technological and cultural regression. The daily, communal act of bathing, once a symbol of Roman identity and civic pride, became a luxury of a bygone era. The ruins of these bathhouses stood as silent monuments to a world that was disappearing, a world where water was tamed and cleanliness was celebrated. A new, more uncertain age was dawning, and with it, a different relationship with water was beginning to form. As Europe entered the early Middle Ages, the practice of bathing didn't vanish entirely, but it transformed. It became a more private, less frequent affair. The grand public spectacle was replaced by a simple wooden tub, often placed by the hearth for warmth. For most people, this was a weekly or even less frequent event. However, in the quiet cloisters of monasteries, the traditions of Roman hygiene were preserved, albeit in a modified form. Monks were often required to bathe as part of their ritual purification, and many monasteries maintained bathhouses, for both cleanliness and health. They understood the connection between washing and well-being, a piece of ancient wisdom that was becoming increasingly rare in the wider world. For the general populace, full immersion in a tub was a significant undertaking. Water had to be hauled from a well or river and heated over a fire, a labor-intensive process. It was far more common to perform a simple daily wash of the hands and face. The idea of bathing for pleasure and social connection had all but disappeared. It was now a purely functional and often infrequent necessity. Then, in the middle of the 14th century, a shadow fell over Europe. It arrived on merchant ships from the east, carried by fleas on the backs of rats. It was the Black Death, the Great Pestilence. The plague swept across the continent with terrifying speed, leaving devastation in its wake. It's estimated that it wiped out between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. In the face of such an incomprehensible catastrophe, people were desperate for an explanation and a defense. The medical knowledge of the time was based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. But this theory was woefully inadequate to explain the plague's relentless march. A new idea began to take hold, one that would fundamentally change Europe's relationship with water for the next 500 years. People looked for a cause, a way the disease was transmitted, and their gaze fell upon the very air they breathed, and the very pores in their skin. A deep and profound fear was taking root, and it was a fear that would make the simple act of taking a bath seem like a death wish. This new, terrifying explanation for disease was the miasma theory. The word miasma comes from the Greek for pollution, and the theory held that diseases like the plague, cholera, and chlamydia were caused by a noxious form of bad air. This miasma was thought to emanate from rotting organic matter from swamps, sewage, and the bodies of the dead. It was a poisonous vapor, an invisible cloud of death that could be inhaled or absorbed into the body. And how was it absorbed? Through the pores of the skin. This is the crucial point where bathing became the enemy. It was widely believed that washing with hot water, the very thing we do to feel clean and healthy, was incredibly dangerous. The heat and steam would open up the pores, leaving the body defenseless. An open pore was like an open door, inviting the deadly miasma to seep into the body, disrupt the humors, and cause fatal illness. Doctors and learned men of the time advised against it vehemently. To bathe was to make oneself vulnerable, to willingly expose your body to the invisible poisons that filled the air. This wasn't just a folk belief. It was the consensus of the medical establishment for centuries. As Europe moved into the Renaissance and the early modern period, this fear of bathing became deeply entrenched, especially among the wealthy and educated classes who could afford to heed medical advice. If water was the enemy, they needed an alternative, and so a new form of hygiene was born: dry hygiene. The nobility of the 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries were not dirty in the way we might imagine. They were obsessed with cleanliness, but their methods were entirely different. Instead of water, they used fine linen cloths to rub down their bodies, believing the friction would remove dirt and the fabric would absorb sweat and oils. And to combat body odor, they turned to an arsenal of powerful fragrances. Perfumes, imported from the East or created in the famous workshops of in France, were used lavishly. Pomatums, scented powders, and sachets of dried herbs were applied to the skin, hair, and clothing. The goal was not to eliminate odor, but to mask it with a more pleasant and more powerful scent. A wealthy aristocrat's morning ritual, or toilette, was a complex affair involving powders, wigs, and perfumes, but rarely, if ever, a full-body bath. Water was reserved for a light rinse of the hands and face, and even then, often with wine or milk mixed in as a purifying agent. Central to this system of dry hygiene was linen. For the upper classes of this period, linen undergarments were the absolute pinnacle of cleanliness and status. Unlike wool, linen is a plant-based fiber that is smooth, absorbent, and can be washed vigorously in hot water and bleached in the sun. The prevailing belief was that the clean linen chemise or shirt, worn directly against the skin, would draw out the body's impurities and sweat. A truly clean and wealthy person demonstrated their status not by how often they bathed, but by how often they changed their linen. Having a vast wardrobe of pristine, white linen undergarments was the ultimate status symbol. It showed you were rich enough to afford the expensive fabric and the labor required to launder it constantly. The outer layers of clothing, the velvets, silks, and brocades, were rarely washed and might be worn for years. But the inner layer, the linen, was the true barrier against the dirt of the world and the supposed foulness of one's own body. It was a form of passive, constant cleaning. The more brilliant your linen, the cleaner and more civilized you were considered to be. It was a complete reversal of the Roman ideal, where the clean body was the focus. Now, the clean garment was paramount. Even royalty subscribed to these beliefs. Queen Elizabeth I of England, a monarch renowned for her fastidious nature and elaborate wardrobe, is famously said to have bathed once a month, whether she needed it or no. To her contemporaries, this was considered frequent and perhaps even a bit eccentric. Her godson, Sir John, who invented one of the first flushing toilets, was seen as a bizarre outlier for championing its use. In France, the court of King Louis XIV at Versailles was legendary for its splendor and its stench. The Sun King himself is reported to have taken only 2 or 3 baths in his entire adult life. The palace, for all its gilded glory, had very few toilets or bathing facilities. Courtiers relied on chamber pots, and the hallways often reeked of urine and unwashed bodies, all masked by a cloying cloud of expensive perfume. This wasn't because they were ignorant or slovenly. It was because they were following the best medical advice of their day. They genuinely believed that avoiding water was essential for preserving their health. To them, the smell of a freshly scrubbed body would have been unnatural and alarming, a sign that the body's protective layer of grime had been foolishly washed away, leaving it vulnerable to disease. But what about the common folk? The peasants, farmers, and laborers who made up the vast majority of the population. They certainly couldn't afford vast wardrobes of fine linen or expensive French perfumes. Their relationship with bathing was simpler and more practical. While they shared the general cultural aversion to frequent, full-body immersion, they were also less dogmatically attached to the miasma theory. For them, bathing was less a matter of medical theory and more a matter of practicality. A full bath was a lot of work, requiring the hauling and heating of water. It was a luxury. However, living lives of physical labor, they would wash when necessary. A dip in a cool river on a hot summer's day was a welcome relief, and not seen as the same danger as a pour-opening hot bath. They would use a communal wooden tub, often shared by the entire family, perhaps once every few weeks or months. Their hygiene standards were certainly not modern, and they lived in close quarters with livestock, but their fear of water was less pronounced than that of the paranoid aristocracy. They had more immediate concerns, and the practical need to wash off the dirt of their labor often outweighed the theoretical dangers promoted by physicians they would never meet. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment began to sweep across Europe. This was an age of reason, science, and a questioning of old superstitions. Thinkers like John and Voltaire championed logic and empirical evidence over unquestioned tradition. This new way of thinking began to seep into the world of medicine. Doctors started to observe the world more closely, to conduct experiments, and to challenge the centuries-old dogmas of humoral and miasma theory. They began to look at water not as a threat, but as a potential therapeutic agent. They noticed that people who lived near clean water sources and washed more regularly seemed to be healthier. The old fears didn't vanish overnight, of course. They were deeply ingrained in the culture. But the intellectual foundation of that fear was beginning to crack. The first seeds of a revolution in hygiene were being planted, not by a sudden discovery, but by a slow, methodical shift in how humanity viewed the natural world and the workings of the human body. The age of reason was dawning, and it was about to shine a light on the unseen world of germs. One of the first major shifts in the perception of water came not from the idea of cleaning, but from the idea of curing. The 18th century saw the rise of hydrotherapy and the popularity of spa towns like Bath in England and Spa in Belgium. Doctors began prescribing the water cure for all manner of ailments, from gout to melancholy. This involved both drinking copious amounts of mineral water and, crucially, bathing in it. The belief was that the unique mineral properties of the water in these spa towns had powerful healing effects. Wealthy patrons would flock to these resorts, not just for their health, but for the social scene. Suddenly, immersing the body in water was being reframed. It was no longer a dangerous act that invited disease, but a sophisticated, medically sanctioned treatment. While the focus was on the type of water, not the cleaning properties of water itself, it was a monumental psychological shift. The act of bathing was slowly being rehabilitated. It was becoming fashionable again for the first time in over 1,000 years, paving the way for a broader acceptance of water as a beneficial, rather than a harmful, element. While the wealthy were taking the waters at fashionable spas, a different and far more grim reality was unfolding in the rapidly growing cities of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution had triggered a massive migration from the countryside to urban centers. Cities like London, Manchester, and Paris swelled with people seeking work in the new factories. They were crammed into hastily built, overcrowded tenements with little to no sanitation. There was no running water, no sewage systems. Waste was simply thrown into the streets or dumped into the nearest river, which was often the same source of drinking water. The term, the Great Unwashed, was coined during this period to describe the urban poor. The stench and filth of these industrial slums were overwhelming. This was the miasma theory made manifest, a world of foul air and pervasive rot. But the sheer scale of death and disease in these cities would soon force a radical rethinking. The old theories were about to be tested in a crucible of unprecedented urban squalor, and they would be found wanting. In the 19th century, a new and terrifying killer stalked the industrial cities: cholera. A waterborne disease that caused rapid, fatal dehydration, cholera swept through the population in devastating epidemics. The 1854 outbreak in the Soho district of London was particularly severe. People were dying within hours of showing symptoms. According to the prevailing miasma theory, the outbreak must have been caused by a pocket of bad air hanging over the neighborhood. But one physician, a quiet, methodical man named John Snow, was skeptical. He didn't believe the disease was in the air. He went from house to house, talking to the families of the victims, and he began to map the deaths. His map revealed a terrifying pattern. The vast majority of cases were clustered around a single public water pump on Broad Street. He discovered that a nearby leaky cesspit was contaminating the well water. Snow presented his findings to the local authorities and convinced them to take the handle off the pump. Almost immediately, the outbreak in that area subsided. It was a landmark moment in the history of public health. Snow had provided powerful, direct evidence that disease was not carried by a vague miasma, but by a tangible, invisible agent in the water. John Snow's work was a brilliant piece of detective work, but it still didn't explain what was in the water. What was this invisible thing that could cause such devastation? The answer would come a few years later from the laboratories of two brilliant scientists, Louis in France and Robert in Germany. Through their pioneering work with microscopes, they were able to prove the existence of microorganisms, bacteria, and viruses. They demonstrated that these tiny, living organisms were the true cause of many diseases, including cholera, anthrax, and tuberculosis. This was the germ theory of disease, and it was the final, definitive blow to the ancient miasma theory. The enemy wasn't bad air. It was an invisible world of microbes that could be transmitted through water, food, and human contact. And how could you fight these germs? The answer was simple and revolutionary. You could kill them with heat, with chemicals, and you could wash them away with soap and clean water. The fear of opening the pores to miasma was replaced by the knowledge that washing the skin could remove a very real, though unseen, enemy. The acceptance of germ theory triggered a massive public health movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, often called the sanitary revolution. If germs in contaminated water caused disease, then the solution was to build comprehensive sewer systems and water treatment plants. If germs on the body could cause infection, then personal hygiene was not just a matter of comfort or class, but a medical necessity. This new scientific understanding led to the invention of the modern bathroom. For the first time, homes were designed with a dedicated room for bathing, with indoor plumbing that brought clean hot and cold water directly to a tap and carried waste away safely. The porcelain toilet, the enameled cast-iron bathtub, and the wall-mounted sink became symbols of a new, modern, and sanitary way of life. Public health campaigns promoted regular bathing with soap and water as a civic duty. The centuries-long fear of bathing had finally been washed away by a flood of scientific evidence. Cleanliness was once again next to godliness, but this time it was backed by the power of microbiology. And so, our journey comes to a close. We've traveled from the boisterous, steamy halls of Roman Thermae through the long, quiet centuries of fear, where a clean shirt was valued more than a clean body, and perfume was a shield against the perceived poisons of the air. We've witnessed the terror of the plague, the slow dawn of reason in the Enlightenment, and the grimy, disease-ridden birth of the industrial city. And we've seen how the patient work of scientists, peering through microscopes, finally revealed the true, invisible nature of disease, transforming water from a feared enemy into our most trusted ally in the fight for health. The next time you step into a hot bath or a steaming shower, take a moment to appreciate it. That simple, comforting act is the end result of a long and fascinating story. A story of how we learned not to fear the water, but to embrace it. I hope you've enjoyed this quiet exploration of the past. Until next time, sleep well.